you need to build the bridge now, because the time when you need that bridge, you're not going to have time to build it. Or let's put it in very stark terms. If it's a natural disaster or a conflict, the fact that we have allies coming to our aid is no small feat, and is not in the moment. That's built in years of relationship building.
Mm.
The Japanese search and rescue crews coming to California in the event of a fire or earthquake, that's very much in part because of the diplomacy that's helped make that happen over the years. I think for me, why should we care overall? It's really about, for Americans, I think, keeping us safe. And this is particularly in terms of the context of the coalition and operations in the Middle East, is preventing attacks. So
Mm.
you remember hearing about the ISIS attack that happened on U.S. soil? No, because it didn't.
Welcome back to How to Diplomat. I'm Jen Upton, and on this episode I'm speaking with Ben Moore, a former State Department diplomat who spent years on the front lines of some of the most complex international challenges, certainly of our generation. We recorded this conversation in the summer during the mass layoffs of US State Department staff, but before Washington released the new US National Security Strategy, which signals a sharp reorientation in US foreign policy, moving away from collaboration and towards isolationism. What makes this timing so striking for me is that Ben's career represents almost the opposite philosophy, a deep belief in the coalition building, international cooperation, and the patient, often invisible work of diplomacy. Amongst other things, Ben helped coordinate the 83-nation coalition that defeated ISIS, a victory that depended almost entirely on the kind of multilateral collaboration many analysts now fear may be diminishing. He's seen firsthand how leadership can convene the world to tackle seemingly impossible challenges, and the human cost, sadly, when it doesn't. Today, Ben serves as Chief of Global Affairs for the city of San Diego. Part of what I'm tracking is a growing move towards subnational diplomacy. Cities and regions stepping up to build international partnerships as national governments step back. It's a conversation about the practical value of staying connected to the world, told through someone who's lived it at the highest levels. Hi, Ben. Thanks so much for coming on the pod today.
Hi there. Thanks for having me. I look forward to the conversation and appreciate what you're doing.
So looking forward to hearing about your adventures. How about we start at the beginning? I think your parents were in Lebanon, and that's where you learned Arabic. Is that correct?
Indeed. So my parents, I was grateful that they picked a place to live in the world to teach while I went to a university, and they picked Beirut, Lebanon. And that is where I fell in love with the Middle East, in particular the culture, but especially the food, I'll say. And that's where my journey began.
Amazing. And is that the first place that you'd experienced living overseas?
I've been overseas before with my parents. I'm lucky that they certainly had the international bug when they were younger. My dad's dad, my grandpa, had started the Peace Corps in India. And then my mom had lived overseas and worked for the UN. We had a lot of opportunity to travel because they had that desire and passion.
Amazing. So it's a bit like a family business. Did that early exposure to the Middle East in particular shape your worldview at all?
I think so. I mean, that was where I think most became aware of kind of how political decisions impact everyone's daily lives. And so I think that really drove in me the kind of mission that I've held central to my own, which is using the power of privilege and place to try and make the world a better place. And acknowledging, especially seeing this in the Middle East, how much politics impacts what we do in our daily lives. So that was certainly where I first experienced that in most kind of real terms, I'd say.
Yeah, I had epiphany is probably too strong a word, but I had such a change in perspective when I went to Cairo in particular. It's obviously a long, not always positive historical legacy that the Brits have in that part of the world. But I came with my little biases and my lived experiences. And this was post 9/11 and post Iraq. And I had a very strong view about the rationale for all of that. And then I got to Cairo and I heard Arab's version of those events. And it really blew my mind because I'd been so closed and thinking about it through one perspective.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think seeing that, zooming out a bit, understanding the deep history in all of the world, including the United States, but certainly overseas. For us as Americans, we're such a new country, and realizing how long people have existed together in conflict, in peace, some of the incredible achievements that have happened, and just how many centuries there are of these different engagements that you're kind of jumping into, in a way. And so I think I realized my own biases, certainly in being someone that had grown up far, far away with a very different view of history, but also appreciation, I think, too, for what these communities in various places have been through, overcome, and succeeded in, and the fact that life goes on in a lot of different contexts. But it was definitely something for me that that changed my worldview quite a bit in terms of where the United States, myself, all of us stand in the arc of history.
Did you always plan to get into diplomacy?
I did from a fairly early age. I'll say there was a point in my life when I was deciding between marine biology and political science. And
Quite the spectrum.
indeed, I could have had a very different life. That's for sure. But I think at some point in high school, I kind of made the decision to go the political science route. And for me specifically, international relations always appealed quite a lot, in part because of the benefit of having had that exposure to being overseas. Also, frankly, to some extent, not being thrilled with domestic politics in the US and how contentious that could be. Not to say that international politics is non-contentious, but I felt like it was a place where I connected more and could feel like could potentially utilize the skills and benefits that I've had to again do something towards the good. So I think that instilled in me fairly early on, definitely in high school, is something that a path that I thought made most sense for kind of my mindset, and hopefully to do some scuba diving throughout the world to satiate that marine biology itch whenever possible.
Not all of your postings you would have managed to do anything related to the sea, which we'll get on to, I think. But hope you managed
That's right.
to get them.
That's right. I'm waiting for that moment when those two worlds fully collide.
Oh, I see. That's a future ambition, not a
That's right.
past. Okay,
That's
okay.
right.
Well, you're in San Diego, so I imagine that's near the sea, isn't it? You get to
I'm
do
pretty
some...
close, and I'll say going over to Scripps Institute of Oceanography here is pretty incredible and makes me think about that world. And there was one moment we could probably get to later where the State Department and Marine sides combined, where there was a buoy that had been lost in the Gulf of Mexico. I'll still call it that for now, that actually drifted over to Cuba. And so we had to work with the State Department to try and help get that back. So it was a very interesting, random event where those two worlds did come together.
Brilliant. You started as a program assistant in the State Department. When you sort of first walked in and started that role, what was going on in your head? What did you think you were going to be doing? Or what did you want to be doing?
I mean, I think ultimately, like, many of us would have the idea that we'll be eventually in that role.
Kissinger.
Where we think, yes, yeah. Ultimately, that's where we'll be in a couple years, right? That's all it'll take. We'll be
Next year, I'll be fine.
negotiating world peace and pulling levers from behind the scenes.
Yeah.
I think I was not, naive to the fact that initial roles, as they are in many careers, are going to entail, a decent amount of clerical work and learning the ropes and sort of showing that you understand the basics, which is really important, I think. I mean, I learned in the passport agency with the State Department, the bread and butter of what we do is help U.S. citizens. And so I learned the rules of the road for passports and those kinds of things. And in our Office of Foreign Missions, I was able to engage with them, admittedly on issues like customs clearances and driver's licenses and that kind of thing. But it's really the basics. You start to talk about protocol and reciprocity and the various things that you kind of think about as a diplomat, right? And so those were really formative in that sense. But for me, it was also interesting to just gain exposure to a lot of different parts of the diplomatic world, including as I took on a program officer role in New York at the U.S. mission to the UN. Our office there had to engage with the North Koreans, with the Iranians, with the Cubans, because they have presence at the United Nations and are physically in New York. So that was actually, I didn't really realize it at the time, but a really unique part of the State Department. So I think, there are so many pieces to what it takes to run a foreign ministry or State Department and to serve the mission that's there. And so It's really important to have exposure to all aspects of that so you kind of understand, from A to Z what it is that we're doing and how it actually works.
Yeah, I remember both myself and also junior baby diplomats that were under my wing, as I became a leader. One of the first things that really surprises them is speaking to adversaries in the diplomatic
Mm,
context. You kind of get it in your head that you just don't speak to them at all. That's the whole currency of diplomacy, isn't it? That you have to engage.
absolutely. Yeah, it's so important to understand where that side is coming from. And yeah, you might not do it publicly. And
Yes.
there are certain parameters around what that engagement looks like, and obviously right and left limits to the topic of discussion and the location. But the importance of having that knowledge is key, I think, both in terms of your ability to understand where they're coming from a kind of humanitarian standpoint, if you will, but then also from a strategic standpoint, what they may do. And so much of what we end up doing at the State Department and when the diplomatic realm is analyzing what our partners, our adversaries, and then the various contexts within which we operate, analyzing what we expect to happen based on various actions. And there's so much that
Mm.
goes into that, in addition to just the raw piece of diplomacy and the fact that when you talk to somebody, especially face to face, it creates an environment that makes it a little more difficult to have your differences lead. I think you have to have a little bit, as part of human nature, a little bit of compassion and empathy. I think that that engagement helps with, even if it's not going to resolve the conflict between country X or Y, it maybe chips at it a little bit in the way that you might not expect.
I agree. I think there's something around finding that consensus in your humanity. Like, you're both human beings at the end of the day. And the more that you talk to other human beings, the more you can find in common. And once you find something in common, that's the basis for bigger agreements and bigger consensus.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Building up from there, having the empathy to think about the other person as a person and the
Mm.
other society and country as a society, as opposed to just this, president or national government or what have you, is so key to building that rapport and trust to hopefully build off of for bigger things. And finding examples, I'm sure you've seen this with diplomats all over the world, and certainly I have, where you make a friend or an acquaintance or a contact that, a decade later may come back into the picture in a way that could be surprisingly useful, helpful, et cetera. And so those connections built over time, again, may not overcome a conflict, but they certainly help in terms of being able to navigate your way through contentious situations.
Was New York your first posting? If you
Yes,
can you count it as the posting?
I'd say that in that period, I was still a glorified intern in terms of the program piece. So it
And when you
felt
were
real.
allowed to go anywhere near.
That's
You
right.
still had your training wheels on.
That's right. They're not pushing me into a whole lot, but I think there was where I felt most connected to what I thought of in my
Yeah.
initial perception of the career. And so I felt that connection and some of the learning about specifically international negotiations, et cetera, just the nature of proximity next to the UN and the incredible amount of work that happens there.
And what was next after New York? Was that Syria? Turkey,
So
Syria?
directly into Syria, yeah. So this was based out of DC technically, but a lot of time spent and up to years spent in Turkey and Jordan in particular, working on Syria. And that to me was the sort of, if Lebanon and being there with my parents was formative in many ways in terms of, appreciation for the broader world, Syria was certainly that formative experience for me in terms of working with the State Department, thinking about all the different levers of power that we have, how those can be used for good in the right context. And then really that empathy piece of thinking about
Mm.
a conflict overseas where people ultimately are just trying to get by. So I
Mm.
felt a lot of connection in terms of Syria and being able to work on that initially. In part, I had studied Arabic in Damascus the summer before, and so had some exposure to the Syrian people, and that was prior to the conflict breaking out. And so had seen what I thought was incredibly inspirational, things happening in their society despite an oppressive government. So I felt in some ways very fortunate, which is perhaps the wrong word, but I was I was glad to be able to work on that conflict, even if the conflict itself was so jarring and deeply upsetting, simply because it seemed to me like something that was very kind of core to what we as Americans and others feel as the, important values in our own societies of a struggle for freedom against tyranny. So it was quite a first couple of years at state kind of formally, but I think I learned quite a lot from that about many different things that have carried on to the rest of my career.
So, was this at the point where you were working with the coalition, or did you move from State Department to the coalition? I
So
should
the
explain.
coalition.
You explain what the coalition is.
Sure, sure. So actually, I from Syria ended up working on the Defeat ISIS coalition quite a
Mm-hmm.
lot. But in the early days of the Syrian conflict, ISIS didn't exist. And so
Mm.
initially it was work very focused on specifically the United States with some partners. We were working fairly closely with a few different European countries who also had deep involvement in and interest in Syria. And essentially, in those early days, our main focus was supporting the Syrian opposition in areas that had been sort of overtaken from the Assad regime, helping them to sort of stand up. And a lot of the work that I did in that realm was in the foreign assistance camp. So, looking at stabilization and humanitarian assistance that could provide support to communities that were no longer under the control of the Assad regime, and to help them kind of stand up, normalize while the broader conflict is going on. Now, around that time, you also had a lot of bad actors, if you will, certainly from the Western perspective, running around, residual elements of Al Qaeda, et cetera, who were kind of taking advantage of the situation. Did not have much popular support in any way, but by nature of chaos, they
Mm.
found a vacuum. And then if you fast forward to 2014, certainly into 15, but 2014 timeframe, you had the emergence of ISIS itself. And that was a incredibly troubling, sort of unfathomable level of, for me, of evil that
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people recognized and saw and said, you've got the Syrian conflict that's happening here between the Assad regime and various opposition forces, but you have this scourge really of ISIS that, as you may recall, fairly quickly took over territory in both Syria and Iraq, did a caliphate. Were executing people publicly. It's just horrendous what they were doing. And so that very much kind of in those years overtook in many ways the prioritization from a policy standpoint for many countries on what to be focused on specifically. But you can't ignore one for sake of the other because this is all happening in a broader context. So it's in that context that the Defeat ISIS coalition formed. And fairly quickly, because of the nature of that evil, frankly, really grew to, I think, ultimately 83 or so countries and entities, which is quite substantial. And I was very grateful to, in part by nature of having worked on the stabilization and humanitarian assistance side, be able to play a role within that coalition, focused on kind of what we were doing on the Syrian context, but looking at communities that had been liberated from ISIS in Syria and in Iraq, and thinking about how we can very quickly support those communities such that they can get back to their normal lives, rebuild, and hopefully be in a place where they have somewhat recuperated from having this happen. But it's sort of a very broad spectrum effort where you've got the military campaign plan, along with allied partners in the coalition, many of which had active duty troops as part of that. And then you had the civilian component looking at kind of the what comes next, governance, assistance, et cetera. And a lot of times my job was bridging the gap between
I
those,
was just going to say.
which was an interesting challenge.
I was thinking through all the ways I was going to ask you this question. So I have had experience on dealing with the different constituents that you're talking about. The military
Yes.
have got one perspective. And, if you look at the kind of strategy, they are at one end of the strategy, maybe the pointy end. And then you've got all the way through, the sustainability, we want a better future for the people of Syria, folks,
Right.
embedding good governance and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
And there's a huge yawning gap in terms of approach and perspectives,
There.
and often kind of
Absolutely.
language as well. So talk me through how you bring those two pandas together.
Well, imagine that plus 83 members of the coalition.
Well, quite.
And
It'll be
so,
like herding cats, surely. But the thing
absolutely.
is, everyone obviously coming at it with the best of intentions, but
Yes.
kind of all over the place in terms of what they can commit to, what they're prepared to commit to, what their governments are wanting them to do, and all the rest of it. So how do you bring that all together?
Right. I mean, not efficiently, I'll say, but at times I'd like to.
You were supposed to say it was a framework I introduced, and it was really easy.
That's right. We had a few of those, of course. So I'd say maybe not efficiently, but ultimately effectively, which is what matters. And certainly when you've got, a combination of all these countries, military, civilian, and otherwise, and some who frankly were just on the sidelines, occasionally casting stones at the glass house because, they weren't actually contributing a whole lot.
Yeah.
I won't name names, but I think the important piece being that there was a united mission and that everyone felt like ISIS was something that had to be eliminated and not allowed to return. And so you had that unifying mission in some ways. But it took, yes, as you said, herding cats, great analogy. I think I heard the term goat rodeo thrown around a few times in terms of what was happening. Ultimately, credibly, I would say, successful in terms of, number one, military defeat of ISIS, in terms of territory controlled, et cetera. And there still are, acknowledged there still are a number of detainees have ISIS ties, both in Iraq and Syria, which is presenting a very long-term challenge in terms of this space. But if you zoom out and think about the fact that there was a caliphate, that ISIS was bringing people for tourism to the caliphate, that they were beheading people on video with fair regularity, that's gone. And that's incredible. And I think there's a lot of credit deserved, particularly to our military colleagues, as well as European other allies who are contributing to this effort, as well as to the civilian side for providing that assistance. And ultimately to the people of Syria and Iraq who have proven incredibly resilient. But in terms of the coalition itself, I'd say, a couple things. Like on the civilian military side, they sometimes can be speaking an entirely different language, and much of the job of you as a diplomat and counterparts on the military side, particularly for the U.S., our civil affairs colleagues are specifically charged with kind of helping to address those gaps. And so I ended up with a pretty incredible cadre of folks, both from the U.S. side, particularly from the British side, as well as a few of our other partner countries who understood and had worked on civil military operations before and were able to kind of bring their respective sides into the conversation in a way that was useful. And we would have joint conversations. We had a strategy that aligned with the military strategy, but a lot of it was talking through, and this is where the human side of diplomacy comes into play, talking through various scenarios. So we had many different planning events in dusty military bases throughout the Middle East, as well as in, DC and European capitals. Many of these events where we took plans, we challenged assumptions, and we talked through the implications and considerations for various, particularly on the military side, if we were going to carry out and prosecute of a specific city in such a way it could create these potential follow-on acts. So it was a lot of the conversation that elicited the understanding of what needed to happen. And frankly, for the civilian side too, to understand, we've got people in danger, our own service members, our partner forces that we were working in. And we need to also think about what ways in which we can, effectively execute this campaign that will limit risk to them as well. And so I saw a lot, I certainly saw some shouty matches between senior civilian and military leadership, was on more than one passive aggressive email exchange. But ultimately, I think bringing us together in these planning events was key. And then also thinking about from the, how do you herd all the international cats standpoint, we really thought about what each country brought to the table, where they had specific strengths and where they had specific interests. And then, as any good government bureaucracy will do, we formed working groups on specific thematic issues. And so something like our civil policing challenge of sort of working with training up and then outfitting police in areas that were no longer free of ISIS. We quickly determined that such a police force in this context was going to not just need to be effective at community policing, but they probably also had to have some kind of paramilitary capability as their residual bad guys running around. And so fairly quickly and early on discovered, and our Italian friends with the Italian Carabinieri had some of the best training for such type of capacity and experience with. And so they were, particularly on the Iraq side, were able to play a very helpful role. And I think the role that they quite enjoyed in terms of it being something that they had, decades long experience in, training up civil police that also had the ability to defend their communities to some extent going on. Another example with our German friends, and this is more in the Syria context, but helping to be the financial backbone behind a trust fund that was enabling Syrian recovery and utilizing both contributions and assets to fund various projects there. So I think we helped identify things that countries could feel invested in and expertise in, and give them ownership of that to be able to take that forward. Now, ultimately, I think it did require, in this case, U.S. leadership to be the convening partner and to push certain things forward. In other contexts, and particularly on the Iraq side, the UN played that role. And I'd say this is a great example for me of the importance of an effective UN. They can be a neutral and central arbiter of so many things, is incredibly helpful in a complex context like this. So we learned quite a lot, I'll say. And I think ultimately, again, the results were very positive, but it also requires sustaining this coalition. And so that's kind of where we are now. And I'm not in the picture as, certainly like I used to be, but dealing with some of the stickier issues that can take time. I think much of that is requires continuing to think about where these bits and pieces of our, broader world's tension happening can become priorities for various countries. And that requires just the continued conversation, again, going back to the importance of that dialogue and getting us where we need to be.
You sort of brushed past planning meetings in dusty military camps, but did you ever actually get to go on on the actual mission with the hoo-ha guys? That's very pejorative, but the really big beefy guys who
right.
wear the really sunglasses.
There were quite a few of those, certainly, and civilian considerations. At the same time, we were far from being able to understand, again, the risk to actually carrying out this mission that they were undertaking. I'll say what we did do is we recognized early on the importance of being shoulder to shoulder as much as is possible. And there's a level of risk intolerance in the U.S. government, certainly, and other governments when it comes to civilians being in places like this. And by civilians, I mean diplomats and our aid workers. But we did form an expeditionary group that we called, it was basically a forward deployment of our diplomatic and assistance experts, otherwise based in Turkey, that we embedded with U.S. and British special operations forces inside northeast Syria. And can't say too much about how that all kind of, took place in terms of specifics, but ultimately really important to have boots, or for us, I guess, shoes on the ground in a way.
We say boots on the ground.
Say boots.
Okay. Stilettos, it's fine.
Less combat heavy boot.
Yes.
It's hiking boots. But the importance of being there face to face.
Yeah.
With our military colleagues so they can understand some of the expertise that we bring to the table. And I think through that deployment, we saw time and again the utility that we each play and the roles that we each play in terms of, the gratitude that sometimes our military colleagues would have for having humanitarian assistance. Also for us connecting with Syrians on the ground and how important that is in terms of feeling that level of trust, feeling their buy-in. We've conscious this is foreign forces and people coming into their country, yes, for a mission that ultimately they feel like is useful, but at the same time, like, what are our motives? Why are we how long will we be here? All these kinds of questions. So important to be able to meet face to face in terms of that trust building. And then feedback for our own support that we're providing. What is actually useful? There are many times where we had come up with a plan to do certain things in a community that didn't resonate with the local kind of council or civilians there. And many times in which things that we hadn't considered, they told us, hey, that would actually be really useful. An example of that is on the civilian security side. We're so focused on training up police that are conscious of civilian engagement and that kind of thing, and psychosocial support. What we also didn't think about initially was the fact that, at night, there's no light. And so in terms of public safety, that's the number one thing. And so that activity that we had providing training to civilian police ended up funding a number of streetlights. And that ended up being one of the most effective things we could do.
No, that has just twigged a long dormant memory of an old boss of mine who was in Turkey, I think probably round about the same time, and he was trying to get funding for streetlights. I wonder if it was linked to the same
It very well could
mission.
It
And
very
he
well
considered that as quite a significant achievement, because quite a lot of program funding is tied to specific outcomes. And unless you can demonstrate that the funding that you're bidding for is related to those, it's like trying to get blood out of a stone. But he somehow persuaded them that, the net impact or outcome of these streetlights meant safer people, more effective policing, etc., etc. But he was really proud of it.
Absolutely.
My brother was in the army, and he spent some time in Iraq and Afghanistan. But what you were saying earlier about actually speaking to communities about what's going to add the most value, he used to say previous tours would come and present, I don't know, an electricity generator or a well or something. And he would go out to these villages and towns, and there'd be like fields of these broken down generators, And,
Right.
You speak to the communities and they're like, just don't give us another generator. What we actually need is X, Y, and Z. So
Absolutely.
they learned that lesson.
And it's so important for us, I think, thinking about Western world here, the U.S. maybe specifically, to understand. I mean, we have a lot of American exceptionalism. We come into these things, we think we know the solution. And very often that might be partly true. And certainly we have people studying this. We have experts in all sorts of fields. But ultimately, every context is different, and it's that human connection that helps you kind of understand what's really needed at that moment. Maybe other things may come. Is it for this community that's just been ravaged by not only by what ISIS did, but then frankly, the fight to get them out, which may have completely destroyed most of their infrastructure and left them with, explosive remnants of war all over the place. What is it they need in that moment that is gonna do the most good?
So when you were talking about, going on this, going with the guys to the forward base. I trained, so I'm an army, I was an army reserves officer. So I went through all of the basic training and went to the military academy. And even when you are preparing to go on this mission, I have residual anxiety about it on your behalf. What were you feeling? Was there any anxiety about accompanying these guys? Did they make you get the kit on? Did you have to do the racing round and carrying heavy packs and all that? Or do they just roll their eyes and go, oh, he's a soft diplomat, we'll carry his stuff?
There's maybe some of that. I should acknowledge I did not go on many of these.
Oh, okay.
So it's mostly my colleagues here. But in the couple of times where I was getting kitted up, I would say, look, the allied forces that we have that are with us on these missions are some of the most intense and perhaps scary to your average person people you can imagine. And so for me personally, and again, not having been much in the danger zone myself, is pretty comforted by that fact, right? And that, I know in a situation like that, we're going to be as best we can be, right? And for the fact that there's so much that goes into pre-mission planning in terms of thinking about where we're going, who we're meeting with, exit routes, all of that. Sure, there is still danger there, absolutely, but I think there's a lot that goes into helping to ensure that's the case. But nerves are absolutely a part of that. I remember in one of our trainings for State Department that we did in advance of just being in the Middle East, was a training where they have you crash cars and also fire various weapons and parts, so you would, in theory, know how to do that in a bad situation. But I remember looking down the line that this is among them, who were shooting these, AK would have you, and being like, man, if we're the last one standing, that's it. This is not going to help. And so with that in the back of my mind, it's also like, you stay as close as you can to those,
the people who know what they're doing.
Guys and gals who know what they're doing.
That's actually a good piece of advice. So our political environments are such that civil servants in particular and diplomats in general are getting, vice versa, civil servants in general and diplomats in particular are getting a pretty rough deal. What case would you make to a skeptical taxpayer about the utility? Like, why should Americans or Brits care about having diplomats around the world and all that taxpayer money going?
I mean, it is a great question at a very difficult time, as you say. I think for me, ultimately, you think about the fact that our partnerships are utilized for so many different things. And if I could put it succinctly, you need to build the bridge now because the time when you need that bridge, you're not going to have time to build it. And that can be the case for so many different things that we think about, whether it's, or let's put it in very stark terms, if it's a natural disaster or a conflict, the fact that we have allies coming to our aid is no small feat and is not in the moment. That's built in years of relationship building.
Mm.
The Japanese search and rescue crews coming to California in the event of a fire or earthquake, that's very much in part because of the diplomacy that's helped make that happen over the years. I think for me, why should we care overall? It's really about, for Americans, I think, keeping us safe. And this is particularly in terms of the context of the coalition and operations in the Middle East, is preventing attacks. So
Mm.
you remember hearing about the ISIS attack that happened on U.S. soil? No, because it didn't. Or if
And
there
that's
was
because the
anything,
coalition was there.
very much so. For our service members and our diplomats and our aid workers who were doing this work to ensure that doesn't come back here. And then, yeah, of course, in terms of the relationship building, I think, there are parts of what we do overseas that some of which will resonate in different communities in the United States. And so that partly brings me to the role where I am here now, is thinking about what resonates with Americans or Europeans or whatever your context is with regard to foreign engagement and international relations? Like, what are the things that you actually think about? Maybe there isn't a whole lot, but then from there, our job as diplomats, frankly, and as part of this system is to help tell that story of why you maybe should care. And again, for certain people, that may be fairly basic. How does this impact my local economy? For others, and for San Diego as an example, we have the largest concentration of military assets in the world here. And so for our service members and their families, I think the context of what they're going into when they're actively deployed, let's say in the Philippines or somewhere else, and why diplomacy and international engagement helps make it less likely that those forces will come into conflicts, which I think, all of us believe, most of us, I'll say, around the world can agree we don't want conflict. And so that, to me, is where the rubber meets the road, is preventing. Yes, there is still conflict and lots of it across the globe, but there would be quite a lot more if we didn't invest in diplomacy. And quickly on the foreign aid side, I think that it is difficult to underestimate the amount of soft power and goodwill that brings to our country and the greater globe. And I think, as General Mattis had famously said, if you're going to not fund the State Department, or in this case USAID, you're going to have to buy me more bullets. That's absolutely the case. And so I think it's very difficult to make that story resonate in a succinct way, in terms of, if you provide humanitarian assistance in country X, that could prevent an attack on facility B. But it is very true. I think thinking about that context and trying to come up, frankly, from our side with more examples of maybe where you can draw that line is a good challenge.
Yeah, I agree. I was just, as you were talking, I was thinking about a piece of work I did on modern slavery and, migrant flows throughout Africa up into Europe. And I get frustrated that there's national debate at the moment about illegal migrants coming over the English Channel from France, having come from Africa and areas of conflict. And it's really frustrating because we keep reducing the humanitarian spend and nobody's bothered to join the dots between the more you help these communities to build a thriving economy and stabilize the conflict, whatever the conflict is, the less migrancy there will be. Less people will be escaping those awful situations if their economies are providing them
Absolutely.
with what they need and opportunities. And so, but I think we're not very good at thinking in longer term, big picture anymore. And I get it, economy's pretty challenging at the moment, but I think, our leaders have a responsibility, don't they, to join the dots a bit better.
Right. No, I think it's very true. And you could put it in, some people put it in a medical context, right? Where you're talking about the prevention and how much more cost effective that can be than treating the disease or the condition later on. Again, it's maybe hard in the moment for people, even in that context, to really think it through if you're struggling with bills and other things. But it's very true. And I think it's been proven in many instances about why this kind of investment and engagement does pay dividends. I mean, the importance of it. And it doesn't ultimately it costs a lot less to deal
Mm.
with the symptom or to prevent the disease than to actually deal with it later on.
So you've alluded to it earlier on, but you have now left diplomacy. Well, sort of.
Formal.
You're a new incarnation.
That's right. So I've left the national level diplomacy, I'll say, to the subnational diplomacy realm, which I'm very excited about. And I think, particularly in this national and global moment, is incredibly important to invest in. Again, going back to that and to focus on, because it has the ability to kind of take down the temperature a bit from some of the national level tensions and conflict that exists, and really focus on kind of more, I would say, pragmatic issues of cooperation.
Do you find the good people of San Diego understand what it is that your office does in international relations, or is there still a bit of a journey to make there?
I think it's a journey overall. Again, it depends on who you're engaging with, but that's certainly a
Mm.
big part of my charge here, is to help message global engagement in such a way that resonates with San Diegans. And frankly, to design approaches that take into account what San Diegans would like to see from global engagement, and perhaps thinking through what are, the top needs that people have here and how can global engagement help benefit those. So thinking a bit outside the box there too. It depends. There's certainly within the business community here, there's a lot of appreciation for foreign trade and investment, foreign direct investment here, as well as expanding our businesses overseas. And we're right on the border, have a fantastic cross-border economy with Tijuana and the greater Cali Baja region. So a business case is pretty easy to make. I think
Mm.
having the city involved in that is very much using the bully pulpit of the kind of executive here and in the mayor in championing, welcoming, and supporting economic partnership. So that's probably one that resonates with most, because you think about investment, jobs, et cetera. Another aspect of San Diego that I think is unique here is, again, going back to the largest concentration of military assets in the world and our armed forces, is thinking about defense, and both how our engagement as a city can
Mm.
complement or at times help make up for a lack of diplomacy at our national level that helps influence a more stable, secure world that impacts our service members, but also taking that another step and thinking about the connection with the economy and the fact that we have so many veterans and others with exposure to the defense realm, and thinking about how we can build up our own defense innovation economy here, become a global hub for that. So be partnering with international allies and others who may want to invest in US companies that are thinking in innovative ways about defense capabilities, or simply be here to help inject funding and benefit from partnership with our own Department of Defense. And so there's that nexus too that I think has an international angle to it that I'm trying to emphasize. And then beyond that, I'd say it's also, for the mayor overall, it's, goals would be elevating San Diego's status on the global stage, having it be recognized as a global leader in so many things, which it already is. And then part B of that is helping San Diegans to understand the benefits of that international engagement. And so that's what kind of guides me. And in that latter realm, it's engaging with all of the different global entities that we have here, from our universities to our civic organizations, et cetera. I'm encouraging them to continue that, exchange of people, of experts, that kind of thing. And then also trying to uplift that work in a way that helps connect with how that engagement benefits us, from, bringing experts here who can engage in collaboration with our universities, to having some of the leaders that come here then go back to their countries and say, hey, we want to see more engagement with a place like San Diego. And that could be things like, let's get in direct flight to happen between our countries, or engage in sister city relationships, that kind of thing. So it's wide ranging for sure. And I think different elements of that resonate with different people, but a lot of the challenge and opportunity is helping to say, how does international engagement help fill a pothole here in San
Mm.
Diego? Help
Mm.
me draw that line, which is admittedly
Mm-hmm.
not always the straightest line, but there
Mm.
is an element to that. And that's the interesting thing for me. And one other thing I'd say in that stage, and working with the mayor here, who's an incredible leader, I think, is also, again, going back to this global moment that we're in and demonstrating a very pragmatic American leadership that you may not be getting from our national level. And I see this when the mayor travels overseas or meets with foreign counterparts. He is, in all senses of the word, an American leader that they're meeting with, a representative, maybe not from our national government, but certainly from governance in the US, representing constituents and presenting the fact that he doesn't have time for a lot of this political bickering, et cetera. He wants to figure out, how can we collaborate? How can we cooperate to solve the issues that we as mayors have to solve? And then also from that, how can I demonstrate the true values of working together and getting things done, that again may not always exist on our national level. So
And are you finding the international community is quite receptive to his messaging?
I think so. I'll
Yeah.
share that, last week in France, we were there on a trade mission, brought the mayor, whirlwind schedule. I don't know how the man, this was so little sleep, but brought him briefly over to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Paris to meet with the head of the North America team there, and a couple others. And in that conversation was happening almost the exact same time that President Trump was addressing the UN in New York, and a very kind of, won't say
Yes.
much about that speech, but not well
Yeah.
received in many countries, nor
Yeah.
even in the US. That at the same moment, you had our mayor in San Diego talking about how we're tackling housing crisis, the fact that we are trying to make progress on cost of living and homelessness here, and what lessons can we potentially share with each other.
And how you can collaborate in the future for mutual benefit to your
Absolutely.
constituencies.
Absolutely.
To me, listening to you, there's a thread of convening that seems to have run through your career, the kind of coalition, even at the UN.
Mm.
And it's one of those skills or those roles as a diplomat you often forget, curating the right people to come together, to have the right kind of conversation, to have the right kind of outcome. So that's kind of one skill or role. Is there any
Mhm.
other skills or practices that, either surprising or otherwise, that you've drawn on from your diplomatic career that you use now in your new role?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. Just touching on that briefly to say that, having the humility to know that you don't know it all. And then from there to have the strategic kind of vision and focus to take those various stakeholders that can be absolutely effective partners and bring them together. And so
Mhm.
I've been fortunate to be in a role throughout my career, and certainly now, where I have a bit of a convening power by nature of where I sit, but also fueled through the recognition that there are experts out there, and it's often you do not need to reinvent the wheel. It's more about bringing the various folks that know different parts of that wheel together to make progress forward. And so that's been the top, I think, for me in terms of translating action in the diplomatic side, experience there, to what can be effective here in San Diego. I think the second thing, which is certainly a part of that we've talked about and touched on too, is that human connection and dialogue and conversation, and how important that is. Really listening, frankly, and having empathy in terms of putting yourself in someone else's shoes goes so far, both in terms of helping them become an advocate and a partner rather than perhaps a competitor or someone who doesn't
Mhm.
work with you, but also to eliciting external ideas. I think that's one big thing that I took away from state, and at times we were very challenged in this, is that when you're in DC,
Yes.
you're in a bubble. When you're in an embassy, you're in a bubble. Many different places you could be in a bubble. Recognizing the fact that you are and taking a step outside of that bubble to purposely have a conversation with someone who disagrees with you, or frankly is just not from the same background. And so within the coalition, that was always the case with these different countries that were bringing things you might not expect. And it would have been easy to ignore their hands. Hey, I know how to do this thing, or even to seek it out if they're not raising their hand. And that's certainly the case here, is coming in with the kind of the benefit in some ways of being an external, a new actor to ask the questions, but also to recognize that, that there is a lot out there that may not have already been connected. And so your job is really to suss that out and sort of figure out who can kind of play what role. And you do that through having a conversation, sitting down with people, having dialogue. So those two things to me are the core of diplomacy, is convening actors together, coming up with solutions and strategy to achieve difficult challenges, outcomes that benefit us all. And then also on the other side, being someone that's willing to pick up the phone, go get coffee, have the meeting in order to distill that information in a way that's helpful for others, but also to develop that human connection that can benefit you in the future.
And also listening, I think you touched on as well.
Mm-hmm.
How do you effectively listen? What's your technique?
Well, it's probably a different story if you ask my wife than if I'm in the diplomatic setting, right? But I think
he just stares out the window and thinks about baseball.
That's right. No, I think ultimately, even if you don't, admitting that you don't know things is part of effective listening, I think, because you can easily sit there and be nervous to ask a clarifying question, or even if you zoned out for a moment, to ask a question that helps steer the conversation in a way that you're still able to frankly understand and gets at what, you need to be getting from them. So I think part of it is you're not only listening in the sense of sitting back and taking that in, you got to be part of the conversation and again, ask questions. And I think another piece of it is also having the patience and taking the time to get to know someone a bit. So much of diplomacy is that and this was something we ran into a lot in conversations with our military colleagues, with no offense to them, they're very efficient, and we are not.
Well, they've got information requirements that they need you to fulfill.
That's right.
They come to you with a mental checklist of the pieces of data that they need.
Right.
And that is it's very transactional conversation. So look, my army hand has come out, do you see?
Here you go, exactly. I need this. Yeah. And they would, at times ask us, I need to get this piece of information from this person. And I'm like, slow down. We're going to need to have coffee first, have a conversation about family, and maybe have a second meeting before we're going to get to, and I get.
And could you see them getting twitchy and their knees started no.
I don't have time for this. And if to be fair, there are certain contexts in active war zone where you're not going to have time for that, right? But generally speaking, it is so important to get to know the person so that again, going back to the empathy question in terms of understanding where they're coming from, but even just to develop that relationship. So it needs to be a conversation that is both, I think, active, but also one in which you are connecting on a more human level.
Yeah. Well, we're coming to the end of our conversation. Is there any final reflections about your amazing career so far you want to pass on? What would you say to younger Ben starting out?
I would say don't hesitate in terms of taking opportunities that seem a little bit crazy, heart-wrenching, nerve-wracking, and feeling like you might not be prepared enough or good enough for those, and knowing that you will pick it up. That everyone to some extent is learning at any given time or should be, and that you should take that into whatever this context is ultimately. And I think I'd also tell younger Ben that, scuba diving and marine biology sounds great, but ultimately probably your more fulfilling path, with no offense to my marine biologist friends, for you, Ben, is going to be diplomacy.
Or scuba divers.
That's right. That diplomacy really is that route that is both, resonates with your broad experience, but also is something that can be translatable to so many different things. I would have never expected to be working for a mayor in a city doing this kind of work, but it really has, in many interesting ways, connected to a lot of that early work. And so, see where that path takes you.
I think that's great advice. Just follow your interests, follow growth, and see where it takes you.
Absolutely. And know that there will be troubles along the way, as many of my colleagues in State Department and former in USAID are experiencing now, but their skills and their passion are so needed in the world, and there will come a time and a path to apply that. It is just, overcoming that and persevering, which is easier said than done, but we've all done that in some way. And so try to send out as many good vibes as I can to all those that are maybe struggling.
Likewise, our thoughts and prayers are with all of them. Good times are ahead, I'm sure.
Yes. And to have opportunities like this to keep telling the story of why this work matters, I think is huge. And that's what, to the extent we all can be, is a good place to focus so that we all kind of understand why this work needs to be done and that it should continue.
100%. And this is what drives me, just to tell everyone's stories and just explain, join the dots and underline why it's so important to have that human connection, get different perspectives and just link countries together, right?
Absolutely.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Ben.
Thank you. Thank you for having me and for taking on this most noble task of telling the story of diplomats.
Sainthood awaits.
Indeed it does.
What strikes me most about Ben's story is that while our national conversations grow more insular, while we're told that international engagement is a luxury we can't afford, people like Ben are proving the complete opposite every single day. The coalition that defeated ISIS didn't happen by accident. The streetlights that made Syrian communities safer weren't installed through wishful thinking. The partnerships that help San Diego thrive don't maintain themselves. And this is the paradox of our moment. Just as federal governments retreat from international cooperation, mayors, governors and civic leaders all around the world are discovering that they can't solve their local challenges without it. Housing crises, climate adaptation, economic development, public safety, these aren't just local issues anymore. They require the same coalition building skills Ben honed in dusty military bases all around the Middle East. For those of us who work in international affairs, the value of diplomacy feels obvious. But as we talked about, that's not immediately obvious to everyone outside our world. The taxpayer struggling with rising costs doesn't immediately see how a trade mission to France helps fill potholes in San Diego. Our job, whether we're diplomats, aid workers, politicians, or simply citizens who believe in an open society, is to help make those connections visible, to join the dots, if you will. Because here's what Ben learned in Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. The cost of not building bridges is always higher than the cost of building them. The question isn't whether we can afford to stay engaged with the world. The question is whether we can afford not to. If Ben's story resonates with you, please share this episode. And if you're working in international affairs, whether at the national or subnational level, know that your work matters more than ever. The bridges you're building today are the ones we'll absolutely need tomorrow. I'm Jen Upton, thanks for listening. As ever, let me know what's on your mind in the comments. Follow me on all social platforms, just look out for How to Diplomat.